Hey everyone, hello to those in person, hello to those at home. For those at home who can't see, pretty small turnout tonight. Given the rain, miserable weather in Sydney, people have had good reason to stay home, but we appreciate everyone who's come out in person, and thanks for joining us. Hopefully you enjoy the meetup. So to begin with, as always, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders both past and present.
And emerging.
And emerging. Onto a bit of housekeeping. Hey, I'm Zach. I help run CocoaHeads along with Nikki, who's not here tonight. And of course, a big thank you to our sponsor, Biloo, without whom we couldn't run tonight. They provided the space and provided the snacks for everyone here tonight. They also help cover some of our hosting costs. So a big thank you to Biloo for that. CocoaHeads has a code of conduct. This is just a reminder. You can read the code of conduct in full online, but it boils down to a few key points. They are to be respectful, be inclusive, and be aware. Any problems or concerns related to the code of conduct, please come and see me tonight. And a reminder that this also applies to online communications. I know we've got people in the Slack tonight, so the code of conduct applies to those as well as our in-person interactions. Speaking of the Slack, we have a Slack community. Everyone's welcome to join. There'll probably be a bit of discussion on that tonight. I imagine a few people are watching from here in person, just a quick photo. It's a fun place to hang out throughout the month, and also a good way to stay in touch with fellow iOS developers. Is anyone attending here for the first time? Welcome. Round of applause. So I have one person attending for the first time, so welcome, Michael. Cool, a shout out to some other groups that you might enjoy if you enjoy Sydney CocoaHeads. We've got Melbourne CocoaHeads. They run on the second Thursday of every month in a very similar format to us, a few talks. It's a really good meetup, and they have a great live streaming setup. So Canberra CocoaHeads, so I believe have been back for a few months now. Is that right, Amy? Yeah. So
like I haven't been, which is me being completely lazy. I need to go. Yeah. Canberra people are awesome.
Is it just Jake?
Not just Jake. Who's there as well these days?
He's
really around the CocoaHeads. It's a joke. Sorry, we have a code of conduct, don't we? So
Canberra. Melbourne streaming is. I don't think Canberra do. So
you know what the Canberra frequency is?
I think it's monthly. Pretty sure. Yeah, it's been going for a few months. I've sort of been loosely following that on Twitter. That seems like
Parliament House.
Good use for something, right? So in-person conferences are back. Very exciting, very cool. So NS Spain, it's in Spain. Obviously, it's in September. Tickets are available now. Actually, I forgot to change that last point. The call for speakers is actually closed. So hopefully everyone who wanted to submit a talk has done so. And we've also got 360 iDev happening next month in Colorado. Tickets are still available, but we've also got a couple of tickets to give away. So they were kind enough to get in touch with us for running CocoaHeads, and are willing to give away tickets to CocoaHeads attendees. So if you're interested, please come and see me tonight. I haven't had a whole lot of interest. They're good for online as well as in person. Might be a bit late to plan an in-person trip, but if you do want to attend online, just let me know and I can probably arrange one of those tickets to go to you.
One question on that. Yeah. Is it run for a really long time, or is it meant to get the 21st to the 28th? Because the date's back to front.
Oh, 21st to the 28th.
Okay, no month long.
These were in last month's slides. Last month's slides too. Good catch. It's not a super long conference, not a whole year. But yeah, no, please come and see me if you're interested. Like I said, we've got those 2 tickets, so it'll be great. And a quick call out to some companies hiring. So Apple is actually hiring in Sydney. Looks like a very exciting role. So if you enjoyed the presentation last month from the Apple Technology Evangelists and you want to join that team, the opportunity is now here. You can apply online. It's a technology evangelist role in Sydney, based in Sydney. But yeah, apply online if you're interested, or I guess talk to Gavin tonight. Looking ahead, we're currently planning our August meetup to be the same location at Blue, Thursday the 18th of July. Obviously, COVID pending, but assuming nothing changes, this is where we'll be. Still looking for talks. So if you're interested, please get in touch and we can sort something out. Now, I did hope we'd have a few more people here tonight for this, but we do have a charity auction. So I've got some old Apple merch to give away. For those in the room, you can come and inspect it in our break. We've got a t-shirt, a jumper, a tote bag, a binder, and some old pins. It's pretty cool Apple merch, actually, from, I don't know when it's from exactly, but obviously very old, but very well kept.
Is it used?
It looks like it might be a little bit used, but not for a while. So as best as I can tell. So if you are interested, feel free to come up. I've got a little card there. There's a charity that you can donate to. Any donation is acceptable, and you can take an item that you like in exchange for a donation. So pretty cool little giveaway / donation thing. But yeah, definitely come and check this out in the break, please. So on to tonight's schedule. We've just had the housekeeping. Our first talk is from Christian, and our second talk is from Mike. So looking forward to both of these. And without further ado, let's get straight into Christian's talk. Round of applause for Christian.
Thank you to keep that going for SAG as well, and Nikki and the team, because they're doing an amazing effort planning all this. It's really great that we can be here tonight, despite the weather. Some people are used to it, but others, it seems, fear the rain. All right, I've got the pleasure to be with you for the next 35 minutes or so, and I'll be talking about two tools that I use often, both in work projects and personal projects, and that's SwiftLint and SwiftFormat. And they are two tools that you can use either independently or together. They are really well complementing each other. And it's just tools that can help us keep our code consistent and safe. And especially when you're working in teams and you've got a certain style guide that you adhere to, they're really helpful on making sure that people follow that style guide, or it can flag out potential problems. So we'll be talking about that today, and I'll also jump into a little live demo afterwards to just show you quickly how it works. And it all springs from the concept of style guides. So we all have different ways of writing code, and if you work in a team or even alone, I'm sure you've agreed on a certain style guide, a certain way to write your code that follows the conventions that your team has agreed on. And if you don't, I wonder how you ever agree on anything, because it's usually a place where a lot of discussion can take place, and that's not always a good use of time. So there are a few standard style guides out there based on general feedback from the Swift community. Probably the Ray Wenderlich is the most used one. But I do want to highlight as well that the swift.org website has some really good sources as well regarding more on naming conventions and the way to build your APIs, not so much where commas and spacings are, but more how to make it easy to understand your code. And yeah, so if you work in a team, you probably have a style guide, and you might have made a few adjustments to it, things that you've taken from the original guide and then adapted to your team's liking, which is super, super fine. And the real benefit here is that if you've got a good style guide and you use it, it can remove all doubt about how to write code in your team. And as long as that guide is followed, you'll end up with a clear and consistent code base and hopefully fewer bugs. So, yoo-hoo. The problem is that humans are creatures of habit, and we usually want to write the code in the way we prefer ourselves. And we also probably default to that because that's just how we've done it. And that sometimes conflicts if you work in teams, because you might want to write it one way, but then now you suddenly have to adapt to whatever that team does. And that can be a hard habit to break, especially if you change projects often, or have a lot of discussions or some weird stance on, for example, tabs. So these two tools are really great in helping us do what we want, but also not actually ruining it for the whole team. So basically, how do we ensure that our code always follows the style guide, no matter how each person likes to write it? That's a challenge. And then you might say, we just do it. We always write code according to the style guide. We never make any mistakes. And that's all well and done. But I think we've all written and submitted some solid code that then had, you go into code review, people say, this doesn't really follow the styling. Can you fix that? Can you fix that? And it's not a waste of time. It's good to have those discussions, but it's just an annoyance when you actually just want to build some pages and you don't really want to bother talking about it too much. So, and it might not be a big deal if your styling is a little bit off here and there, but I found that it can be really frustrating to work in a code base where nothing just ever looks the same. Everything just looks weird and different because a different person wrote it. So in addition to that, what if you have a style guide and you want to introduce a new rule, or you change something, you've agreed, we want to do it this way now. How do you help your team easily adapt to that and learn those new rules, get used to that, especially for new people coming into the team? These tools can help you just highlight when they've done something that the team didn't agree on. And even better, how could we just fix all of it at once without actually doing anything ourselves? One solution is, as I mentioned, we'll find it in the pull request and then we'll comment it out. We will point it out and people can go in and make their updates, and that's all well and done, which is great. Obviously, you should always watch out for these things, but it also takes time away from what's really important. And we don't always catch these little mistakes. So, and we don't really want to spend time on, figuring out, is this comma in the right place, or are these function parameters correctly aligned and all that. Like, it just takes time away from the things that we really want to do. So this is where the concept of linters and formatters enter the picture. And they are these tools that can tell us, highlight when something's wrong, or can look a bit risky, potential bugs, and they cannot just point it out to us, but in some cases they can actually just go straight and just fix it, which is great. One of these tools is called SwiftLint. So if you're unfamiliar with linters in general, there are linters for probably pretty much any programming language out there. It's just about looking for them. And so in general, a linter is a tool that goes through your source code, analyzes it, and it flags out programming problems, potential bugs, styling problems, and things that maybe the language says, this is not, there's a better way of doing this or a more efficient way. Just in general, they help you make better code. And this is an example of SwiftLint in action, where it's pointed out a warning where that was a colon that wasn't on the right side. And in case of this, there's this error as well that says, force casting should really be avoided because they can cause crashes. And that's great that it helps out that way. So SwiftLint is a linter, and it bundles well over 100 different rules as standard. And a lot of them are enabled by default, so they're just ready to use. And they are generally based on what the Swift community likes. Again, probably based on, it's based on a certain style guide. And it does a really great job out of the box. So it really helps make your code look great and clear and consistent. And this is just a small portion of the rules. I think there are well over, 100, 150. And there's a lot of different kinds. So you might see some about tabs, some about different file headers, things like that. So some of them are about styling, and some are more there to help you prevent problems or crashes, like force unwrapping, prohibited supercall, different kinds like that. And it's a really great tool to prevent problems. So one example I've had in the past is that we had a code base and we implemented SwiftLint and we enabled some of the rules, and then it flagged out problems. For example, in one or in multiple cases, we had view.did.load functions where we had forgotten to call super inside, which probably doesn't create problems straight away, but it might do. And that's just the things you want to avoid, because that can be a tough one to hunt down. And we even had a case, or even a couple of cases, where we had a view.did.appear method, if you still remember your UI kit, that is. And in there, we were calling super.view.will.appear. And that's, again, it's an easy mistake. It's a tough one to maybe find out a code review, but it can just cause problems down the line that you might not even think about. So it's a really great tool to have to help finding these kinds of things. And at its core, it's just a command line tool. Like anything else that we use, you can install it via Homebrew or just by source or through various methods. And the way you run it is you open up your terminal, you call SwiftLint in your project folder, and then it starts outputting different warnings and errors and things. You can see which file it did it on what line, what character. So it's very easy to go to have a look at this and then go into Xcode and open the file and then fix it. Well, it is easy, but it's quite time consuming to do it this way. So, plus it's not very easy to actually pass this, to be honest. It's not the best way to do it. So there's a better way. We can actually let Xcode help us with that. So basically, what you can do is go into your project build phases, and then you can go in and add a new run script phase, and then you add a few lines of code that basically says, if SwiftLint exists on the system, then run the tool, and otherwise throw an error saying it's not installed. So people can see, oh, I need to install the tools. And what that does for us is that now in Xcode, you will have warnings show up straight in your issue navigator. And then you can click on each warning or error. It will take you straight to that file, straight to that line, and you can instantly fix it right there and then. And that's wonderful. There's also, in SwiftLint, some errors, or rather some violations can be configured as errors, which means that you can even prevent your project from building at all if you have particularly risky things, for example, force unwrapping that you just want to prevent. And as a side benefit of that, it also means that assuming that your CI is set up to run these tools as well, it will also throw errors and stop your build from progressing, so you don't risk putting out a faulty app to your users. And that's just great. It's always good to find problems early. And then you think, I've got better things to do than sitting around clicking warnings all day and fixing little commas and colons. And what if we introduce a linter, and then there are just, in some cases, if you have never used it and you just enable everything, you can have thousands of violations, and no one wants to sit around and do all that except me, because I'm a bit of a freak and I enjoy that. So 2 tips on that. First of all, just introduce one rule at a time, disable everything else, have one, agree on that, go in and fix it, and then make sure there's no warnings, and then you can progress from there. It's really useful to gradually roll a tool like this out because, again, depending on the age of your code base, you can have a lot of violations or things that you need to go in and fix. And it can be a bit time consuming if you just do everything at once. Secondly, SwiftLint has a really cool autocorrect feature. Well, they call it fix now. So basically, if you call that command, it goes into your project and checks your code and changes your code to just fix everything. Well, everything, not everything. More, it goes in and fixes the sort of risk-free rules that pretty much are only about styling. So phrases, colons, commas, all that once again. And that's super helpful, but I also want to give a word of caution. Obviously, go in and check those changes it did before you actually commit it, because usually it's safe. Sometimes it does have some false positives, or it might actually change things that causes your project to not build anymore. We had a case about that for a Swift format where, it's new tools. We upgrade Xcode. That tool might not be handling some corner cases yet. That's perfectly fine, but just go in and double check. And so when we work in a team, how do we help each other and how do we make sure that our project is in a good state? There's no warnings or errors around the project builds and everything. And because I don't think I've yet worked in a company or project where I've opened up a new code base and there was no warnings and no errors. And my eye catches that little yellow triangle, like I don't know what, but I don't like seeing it, and I really like to get to fix these kinds of things, because even if it's just a warning, it can be a potential problem now, or even or in the future. So it's better to just figure out what it is, solve it, and get on with your day. So a way to help or in a team make sure that you keep your code base well maintained. I think it's really important to make it a habit to just fix things when you see it, following the Boy Scout principle. If you see a problem and it's not too far or too unrelated from what you're doing, just go in and fix it and help your team out. And definitely go in and check the code that you just wrote or changed before you commit and push. Because if we don't fix these warnings, they'll be there for the next person, and that's just giving more work to your coworkers or giving them little annoyances maybe. And let's be a good citizen and clean up after ourselves before we push our code. All right. So in some cases, there can be exceptions to these rules. Sometimes you might have a style rule where it's okay that there are exceptions. And in this case, SwiftLint makes it super, super easy to go into your code and disable them. So they don't show a warning anymore. Needless to say, because it's easier to disable them than fix them, doesn't mean that you should just go in and disable when it's just an annoyance for you. They are there for a reason, something you've probably agreed with your team to do. So it's better to spend that little extra minute and fix them instead of just going in and disable them. But if you choose to, then there are 3 ways you can do that in SwiftLint. So in this example, we've got a table view controller that we force unwrap. And I'm not saying this is a great example, but in some cases it can make sense when you've got code that you guarantee will work. And 3 ways you can do this is that you can have a block of code. Let's say you've got 3 force unwraps, and then you just want to disable that rule around that. If you look at the top 3 lines, then you can create like a SwiftLint disable block around a block of code, and it will just disable that rule until it hits an SwiftLint enable, which is important because if you don't add the SwiftLint enable, it'll just disable it until, infinity, even in other files. So it's pretty important to remember that. The middle option is just to disable that rule for the next, not necessarily the next line, but the next instance where it happens. And the last option is just to write a SwiftLint disable this at the end of the line, which disables it just for that particular line. And that's usually what I do because I usually just have a single thing that I want to disable. So that comes in really handy. That's all cool. But as I said, SwiftLint ships with a lot of default rules, and they bring you a very long way if you already conform to the general style guide that is well used in the community. But if that's not quite enough, you can actually go in and customize SwiftLint as much as you want. You can add additional rules. You can disable some rules maybe that your team did not want to use, or it goes against what you want. Or you can basically go in and do anything. And it all happens in a swiftlint.yaml file that you put in your root of the project. And it's got different options. It might be hard to see here, but you can go in and exclude certain files and folders. You can disable some rules. You can add some extra rules that SwiftLint provides that is not enabled by default. Or you can go in and configure different things. So like, let's say this rule, we want it to be an error. You can go in and say, this needs to be an error. Or for example, you can go in and say the default line length is 120 characters. We are modern people who've got white monitors. Let's make it 180 or something. You can go in and do that, and then it'll take that into your take that preference into account. So it's a really fun tool to play around with and just adjust to whatever rules that you have in your team. But if you're still not excited and you want to take it a little bit further, you can actually also make custom rules, i.e. you can make your own rules. Woohoo! So it works like this. You still do that inside your configuration file. And basically, you can write your own rules based on regex. And I've had a lot of fun with that in the past to create SwiftLint rules that, again, for example, if you've got something in your style guide that's just what that team prefers, but SwiftLint doesn't really provide something to enforce that out of the box. You can go in and define your own rule. And I recommend to give that a try and get some more experience in regex, because that's also very useful just in general. So this on this configuration, I hope it's visible to some extent, but I've added a couple of things in the past, for example, for Boolean return values. So it goes in and checks like that if we've got code that says if this, then return true, otherwise false. It's redundant. You can just return the value in the beginning. And so we made it a rule that just goes in and says, you can remove this bit of code because it just doesn't add anything else extra. So that's cool. I also had you'll see the bit in the bottom there. I added a rule because we had a rule or an agreement that all classes should be final by default. And SwiftLint did not, at the time at least, have something to check for that. So we went in and wrote it ourselves, and then it flagged anything that was not final. So that's really, really helpful. But coming back to a point that I made earlier, JP Simmer that created SwiftLint says, just because a rule exists doesn't mean that you should use it. And I think it's a really important point, at least what I interpret it to mean, because for one thing, if you've got too many rules, they can just be annoying and get in the way of what you actually want to do. And the other thing is that just enabling everything doesn't mean that your code magically gets any better. It might actually get worse. And it comes down to that just because a rule exists, it doesn't mean that it's right for your project, right? So you should never blindly trust that because something gets flagged out, it's a violation, it means that you are wrong and that the tool is right, because otherwise, like when it comes down to it, you are the one that knows your code base, you know what's right in that situation. So it's probably a common pitfall, especially for new developers. I did it myself, just saying, this is a tool that does this, it must know better than me. Let's just do it. But no, I think it's really important to check and understand what each thing does and make sure that it's actually right for you. So in summary of SwiftLint, it's super fun to play around with and to find new rules and things you can introduce to help your team. But again, it's also very easy to get carried away and just sit playing around with it night after night and forget to spend time on what's really important, which is exactly to develop new features. So it's a tool that it's worth spending a bit of time setting up with your code base, making sure that it looks good, but it's not the most important thing in the world. But we still want it. And ideally, we want linting and formatting in place to help us without us even noticing that it's there. So SwiftLint can take us some of the way, but in order to get to the finish line, I want to introduce a more specialized tool, which is called Swift Format. And it complements really, really well with SwiftLint. It's basically a tool that it does the same thing in a lot of cases. There's a bit of overlap, but it's a specialized tool that has the purpose to go in and edit your code and format it in the right way. Kind of like when you select all your code in your Xcode and then tap Control-I, it just auto indents and things like that. This text is just way above that. And it works the same way. It's a command line tool that comes with some standard things, but you can also get a configuration file where you go in. Again, you can say, I don't want you to mess up these my parts folders or third-party things. You can go in and enable certain rules. You can add options to say, we want 4 spaces instead of 3 spaces, or we want our function parameters to start at the same line or the next line. You can do pretty much whatever you want. And again, you can go in and disable certain rules that your team doesn't want. And once again, to really help you point it out when you work with your code, you can go into Xcode and add a build phase, add a run script, and then add, like before, but just Swift format, dash lint, dash linian, and then the period just means everything in this folder. And then it goes in and it won't, if you do this, just the lint option, it won't actually change anything, but it'll give you warnings in your Xcode while you write it to say, again, there's too much spacing here or whatnot. So you can do that if you like. I do like that in Xcode to point it out to people and help them understand what kind of rules to have in place. But to really take it to 11, I think we want to make our tooling here really invisible. And to make it really shine, I've learned that we can use Git hooks to run these tools and make sure that before we commit and push, it will just run it and make sure to reformat all our code, make sure that it's good to go. And what this really gives us is, or just by running the tools, it means that in your day-to-day work, you can sit and write your code however you want. Like you can do it in any way you want. But as soon as you commit, it will automatically reformat everything before it pushes it for code review. And it means that no matter how you write it, your code base will always stay the same along with the rest of your team. So it means that you can do what you want, and then it's not going to cause a problem for anyone else. So, and you can combine this with tools that, because by default, it just reformats everything. Sometimes, again, if you introduce it in the beginning, there might be a lot of things. So what you can do is to combine these two tools with something like Git format stage, which means that you can go in and only run the tools on lines and things you've actually staged and changed, so not everything. And then you can go in and apply that formatting and stage those changes and then include that in your commit. That's a lot of words. So let's jump into a little demo to show it in action before I close off the show. So this is an old presentation, which means, and I made a little demo app back in the days to show, just to have something which you can see. So that's wonderful. Just pop this over here. So what you'll see here is, it's just that it's a little app that shows an image of former projects I've done. It's really, really, really unimportant what it does. So it was just to have something to run. So what you will see is that, we'll go into this one first. Here we've got a file where, I'll just this one. So here in Xcode, we've got the tooling running in the build phases like I showed. And you can see I've got a bit of code here. What it does is not actually important. It just shows that this formatting is all over the place and it doesn't look great. So we want to take advantage of Swift format to go in and help us with that. And what we can do is to, so what we can do is we just run Swift format and then a dot. And then when I run that, you should see that it has completed and formatted a couple of files. And if you noticed, it now automatically reformatted this bit of code. And if I rebuild, all the warnings are now gone. How cool is that? So that's Swift format. It's really, really, really cool to just help out with that. Coming back to Swift Lint, we've got I want to show a couple of things. Here, coming back again, we've got this is a bit wider. We've got a bit of code here where we load some images from a file, and you'll see that Swift Lint points out that we're using force unwrapping here, and we should really avoid that because that can cause crashes. But in this case, I want it to fail because if this image file does not exist, I want to know it immediately because it means something is pretty wrong with my project. So in this case, I actually want to go in and just make this a bit bigger and disable these warnings. So what I do is I write Swift Lint disable and then the force unwrapping. And then again, as I mentioned, we have to remember to enable it back. And this means that now when I rebuild, they should go away and build succeeded. There we go. Excellent. So this is how you can disable SwiftLint from certain exceptions that you have. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you is that coming back to those custom rules. So in a project, SwiftLint ships with a standard rule that's called to do, which basically flags out any to-dos or fixes or anything like that, because usually that means your code is incomplete and it's something you don't want to miss out on. So, but I do like to hand in little to-dos here and there, and it gets, if you like that, it gets a bit annoying, and basically you lose track of them if all of them are just flagged. And what we did for our project back then was that I made a custom rule that says, it's fine to add to-dos, we don't want to flag them out, but they must have a Jira ticket ID with them. So we always know we can go into Jira and find a ticket and then come back and search for that ticket in the code and instantly take us to that to-do, which was really, really helpful. And that's why this particular warning happens. It says to-do without Jira reference, do not add to-dos without Jira reference. Easy. So basically what you needed to do was you add your ticket ID and you can rebuild, and now we are safe that this to-do is tracked somewhere and is not going to get lost. And that brings our project to 0 warnings. Wonderful. So I'll pop back to my presentation and I'll just close off. So in summary, using SwiftLint and Swift format, we can, in many cases, prevent bugs, get a really clean and consistent code base, and make sure that we stick to the rules that we define. It removes the whole discussion element of it, so you don't get into fights. Save time in pull requests, save time in discussions, and we can spend our time solving problems instead of pointing them out, which I find is very useful. So I can definitely recommend trying to implement these projects either at your workplace or in personal things. Play around with it. It's really, really fun. And lastly, I want to recommend a couple of things. So usually what I've done is just to have SwiftLint and Swift format locally installed and then upgrade it as new versions come out. But if you work in a team, then you've got to have that, you've got to make sure that everyone runs the same version, because new rules might be introduced, then you have warnings, but the other person does not. That's a mess. So try to use some sort of dependency manager to keep that version locked. Look out for new rules that releases or bug fixes, and try to automate your style guide as much as possible so that it's just automatically followed and you don't need to really check it. And also I could recommend looking into a tool, for example, Danger, to automatically add comments to pull requests if some of these warnings actually still go into review. So again, it can help your team be confident that they don't have to look for these starting things. The tooling will just catch it for them. And have fun with it. Don't forget what matters in the end. And lastly, these tools are open source, so go ahead and contribute to them if you can, even if it's just changing a bit of documentation. Anything helps. And that's all. So I've posted some links to the tools, and I've also posted a link to my own little repository where some of these custom rules that I've written in the past can be found, including the Jira one. I find that very cool. And I just want to say thank you for listening.
Christian, that was great talk. Do we have any questions for Christian?
Yeah. So you mentioned that you can include the SwiftLint on build phase. So
Yeah.
I was wondering, have you measured how does it affect the incremental build time?
I have. It's always been a concern when we had these tooling things, and a lot of people are they find it very, very important that, an incremental build is just, I don't want anything other than my actual changes to be rebuilt. I don't want any tooling because it just adds, even a couple of seconds for them was redundant. They didn't want that. And that's fine. You can take it out. But in my experience, even at a very big code base, like several hundred thousands of lines, it adds 1-2 seconds max. And especially if you combine it with something like Git format stage, you will only run it on the things you've actually changed. So it takes it down to like milliseconds. So I think it's worth it to have it, even if it's at 1 or 2 seconds.
Does running it at commit time help with that as well? because it's not doing it.
Yeah, so that's another thing. Like you can have it in your build phase, but you can also not have it and just have it in your commit hook and then make sure it will just do it. I recommend that for Swift format, not for Swift Lint, because it might not. Again, it's really helpful to have it in Xcode to be able to see where it is. But I can recommend running Swift Lint fix in your commit hook to take care of some of these things as well.
Fast.
Very fast. Yeah.
It gets slow because people say that they're going to be consistent with the way they write code and then they're not. And then they don't want to use Swift Lint, but that's not the tool's fault. That's the person on the other side of the keyboard not following the Swift Lint rule that they said they didn't need because we all write code the same. But now that we've got the tool, it turns out we don't, and we don't want the tool anymore.
That's a good point. So if you find that your Swift Lint takes 5-10 seconds, maybe you should follow the style guide and to start with. So
and just turn on warnings as errors, and then it'll really piss everyone off. And they won't be as concerned by Swift Lint.
Then also start.
Craig Stanford's not here to talk about the time I did that to him.
Hang on, I can hear him.
Yeah, exactly. Just one thing for me to point out, Christian works for Billu, so if any of you turn on SwiftLint and you have 1,200 errors, Christian did say he's really excited to work on projects like that. Give us a shout and we're happy to take him up on that.
I'm not even kidding.
No, he's super excited. You can tell. He's like, I'm in. I'll come clean your code base up. Good.
It's such a pleasant thing. It's like, when you start watching those videos where it's just like comfort, what's the word? I don't know. It's just so comfortable and like
you're like, what was the lady that did the house renovation stuff? It doesn't bring you joy. You've got to throw it out. That.
Yeah, exactly. Like
that's her. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So no, I think it's great tools. They can really help if you want them, but you gotta want them and you gotta see the value that they bring. So, Amy.
Yeah. Point of contention. SwiftLint can take minutes. I've seen it take minutes. Not going to provide an example, but yes, SwiftLint with lots of SPM packages on an Intel machine can have performance issues. One thing I'm curious of, do you know of any progress to run things like SwiftLint and Swift format as SPM plugins?
Good question, and it's something that I'm excited to look into. I saw recently that I think Swift format or someone added it for Swift format. I haven't tried it out myself, so I can't really give you a good answer on progress, but I'm sure it's going to come within a couple of months. It looks like an elegant way of having it in your project, making sure that you've got the right version and all that. So I'm going to be twice as happy when that comes around. Because that's a pain to keep those versions in match in sync.
Do I have actually? Okay.
Go ahead.
Different question. So running Swift format, it will change the file underneath Xcode. Do you know of a way to make sure Xcode's undo history is left intact when running Swift format?
So I sense that's a bit of a trick question because the case right now is that when you run Swift format, again, as Amy pointed out, it changes the underlying file. So you're not able to undo it, which is one of the reasons that I do not recommend having it in your build phase with the format option. Like I only recommend the lint option. No, I don't know of a way to have some sort of undo except for your version control because you can still undo it there. And Swift format is built to only affect things that cannot break anything. So like formatting, but I've seen it actually cause build errors. So beware, but then your project won't build. So I'm pretty sure you can't, it can't really mess anything up into the point where you lose something. But yeah, keep it in mind that you shouldn't have it, like you're gonna lose your undo history if you use it inside Xcode. Yeah.
So if eventually it becomes possible to use SwiftLint and Swift format as SPM packages, is it possible then to exclude them from the actual build code?
That's another good question. I don't have experience using them as packages. And you can already use them in your project as packages. It will still need to compile it because that's what packages are, right? But it won't actually be in your app. So, because if you don't add the library as part of your app, then it's not going to be in the shipped app.
Yeah.
But it's a point still, if you use it in a Swift package, it's going to take a bit of time the first time to fetch it and build it and things. So, but that's the same with like CocoaPods or anything else. But it's kind of a one-time thing. It's probably not going to be too much of a problem. Yeah.
I'd just add one thing that we did. You said Swift format shouldn't muck things up. I've definitely had a case where a specific version of Swift Lint decided to change something and made it not compile. Going,
Yeah.
what? And then when I researched it, it was a known bug and we had to upgrade. It was Swift Lint version. So
Yeah. No, it definitely can cause problems. But again, I think it's worth it. And I just figured out I forgot to tell you or show you one thing, which I won't. You'll have that. You can come see that later. I'll hand over the reins for the break.
Thanks, Christian. Another round of applause for Christian. Yeah, we're going to have a pretty short break, probably 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll be back with Mike's talk. So enjoy, get some pizza over, and see you soon.
Yeah, there.
Okay, thanks everyone. A round of applause for Mike next talk.
You. And yeah, first of all, thank you very much for a chance to talk about my favorite tool over the past 2 years, which is SwiftUI. So the title is working out with SwiftUI. Quick intro. My name is Mike, and I like to, as you probably noticed, I like to read comic books, hack random stuff, and just running in Sydney and lurk on Twitter. And for the past 4 years, I've been working on a workout app called Strong. So that's the whole theme of this presentation. So you can track like your sets, your records, and you can track it both on iOS and on watchOS, and also on Android. So, quick story to get a good vibe of this talk. So one day in 2020, I was rewatching the talks about SwiftUI because I had a chance to go there in person in 2019. But it was like it was just the beginning of this whole wave about Combine and SwiftUI was all fresh. I was focused on finishing touches in the project. So I had some spare time to rewatch some of the talks, and I got pretty hyped because I really like UIKit, but on the other hand, to make some prototypes or simple UIs, it took a lot of time to design something that you can present to your colleagues or managers or bosses. So the problem was that I needed to think about it really deeply because many of the articles and talks are about starting with SwiftUI. So you're starting with SwiftUI lifecycle, but it doesn't really take into account that probably many of us were having a lot of classes and structs that we created for our colleagues over the past 5, even 10 years. So that was the case in my project as well. So we had a lot of classes written in Objective-C, using storyboards, graphics, just CocoaPods, all that stuff. So I had to really think if I want to rewrite something, or maybe I should just still keep using the stuff that is working pretty well. So I thought about it for some time and came up with the idea, of course, I'm gonna rewrite it. That's a great idea, right? Because it's a new shiny tool, so why not? It's gonna be great. So I started to work on it with my friends from the team. So we began with simple screens, and then we progressed over and over. It took a little bit of time, of course. Let's say that was about 2 years because we started in 2020. Right now we have 2022. The pandemic's still on, unfortunately, but let's say that. I can say something about our experience after those 2 years. So how was it? Was it worth it? I would say, yeah, but many of the things that I thought that are wrong with SwiftUI, it was mostly because of our mindset. We were trying to force some of the patterns that were applicable in UIKit, but in SwiftUI, we needed to change our thinking, or even the code structure, right? Because many of the things were written exactly to power UIKit or some like custom classes, but some of these models, controllers, they were not working pretty well in SwiftUI. So in hindsight, I would say like it would be pretty cool to have like some sort of like a coach, because if you go to the gym, if you can afford it, of course, or maybe you have some colleague that has some experience, you can ask them. So of course, in 2020, we were all fresh and didn't have a lot of experience with SwiftUI. So it's, of course, we were still learning, but like right now, I imagine that I can meet some sort of coach that's gonna talk to me or to my colleagues, and we can discuss what's wrong, or maybe we should tweak something, or maybe change approach towards some of the things that we already having. So if you go to the coach, you're gonna have like initial lecture or class or lesson, and he or she are gonna introduce you to some like best practices at the beginning, not to kill yourself or just have some bad injury. So yeah, it's just a random list, but I imagine that'll be pretty great. And I, by no means, I'm not a coach, of course, in SwiftUI especially, but we all can imagine that we can support ourselves because SwiftUI is still a pretty fresh tool. And if you go to Apple forums or Stack Overflow or Slack, you can see that people are still trying to find themselves in this unknown area. So we can act as coaches to ourselves during the meetups, at work, on forums. So let's say that I did make some tips wrapped in the form of workout. So to start workout, you need to have a good warm-up. It's something that many people are skipping. And that's the thing with SwiftUI. It's something that could have saved me a lot of time when I'm thinking about it right now, but yeah, you need to just make this mistake and learn the hard way. Maybe that's the best way to do that. So how do you warm up with SwiftUI, especially when you're coming from the land of UIKit, view controllers, storyboards, and all that stuff that we've been doing for the past 5-10 years. So as a beginner, I just jumped into the existing code base and was trying to integrate some of the things that I saw in DubDub talks and sample code. And I was trying to force that code into our code base, which is probably not the best idea if you're coming from UIKit world, from my experience, especially if all of the logic is engineered around UIKit or WatchOS, depending on the platform, maybe Mac. Everything works around view controllers, core data, classes, whereas with SwiftUI, we're trying to embrace structs. So that was a hard lesson to have, unfortunately. So what I do now is to just start a new project, which sounds a little bit weird, but I'm gonna explain it in a second. So same with going to the gym. A lot of people do just hitting the gym straight away and trying to put a lot of weight because of like ego or expectations that I'm gonna lift like, I don't know, 80 kilograms on a bench. And yeah, it ends up pretty badly. So that was probably my approach as well with SwiftUI, because I just jumped and was trying to push all the cool stuff into the project. And yeah, so I wasted a lot of time because of my mistakes. But if you have a coach gonna say that, okay, let's go back to the basics and let's see like the bigger picture of your situation. So if you have any injuries, if you have any experience, maybe you are predisposed to do some movements or exercises. So that's the same stuff with the project. And because of SwiftUI, DSL, it's very easy to build simple yet flexible UI, and you can pass your structs or classes and see what's going to happen, how it's going to work. Because as I mentioned, a lot of models are still built on the premise that it's going to power UIKit. So I started to make new projects, like a lot of them, because I noticed that the models are messing up with SwiftUI because they're refreshing too often. I'm using wrong bindings. or there are a lot of calls to properties, and they're not they're being refreshed, but the content is still the same. So let's say like the same string being passed and SwiftUI was refreshing it all the time. But if you're gonna isolate your case into one single project, there are a few benefits. First of all, it's gonna be much faster to iterate, because I know about you, but our project is not super big, but incremental builds on M1 can take like 10, 11, 12 seconds, which is not horrible, because I know that some of us working on gigantic projects that are gonna take like 30, 40 seconds on incremental builds. But features that we want to implement SwiftUI, it's mostly about UI, and it's something that we can recreate on a blank project, and then we can add on top of that. And there are three elements that I can point out. First one is SPM. So before SwiftUI, we extracted all of the core logic into SPM package. And that was a great idea when I think about it now, because we can create those small projects through SPM packages, and they're going to power the logic inside that's a simple SwiftUI view. If you don't have separate SPM package, you can just drag and drop, but it's probably a little bit cumbersome, and you may have extra logic hidden in some models or controllers. So you can either write it, just take JSON, let's say from the server, from the response that you're getting from your API, or you can use sorcery. So that's what I've done. So we, of course, as like with any modern iOS app, we're communicate with REST API. So you can take JSON and you can recreate very simple struct that can power list or lazy V stack. And that's usually enough to see if the case that we want to create, it's going to be suitable, and we don't need to move to UIKit. SwiftUI is going to be just enough. And it's something that when I was talking with some of my friends and colleagues when we were working on SwiftUI, many of them just skipped sample code for some reason. I know it's not perfect because it's called sample code, but it's also a really good source of insights how to model SwiftUI views, because you need to respect some of the rules that are powering SwiftUI. Off the top of my head, I can come up with one of the cases that we had. So the performance on long lists in the lazy V stack wasn't great. And of course, it was because of me, because I was implementing it. But the point is that I created a view that was containing rows. So I had a section that was containing row. So let's say you have a gigantic V stack with header, with section, and inside there were rows. But the problem is that when you're not using SwiftUI dot section and then for each inside, it may cause problems with performance, because if you're refreshing the section, it may also reevaluate the contained views inside of that pseudo section. Whereas if you use SwiftUI dot section, I can imagine it's probably gonna be reused or rebinded into some sort of like collection view header structure. So that's a great way to isolate your case and make sure that everything's right with your attitude and your thinking how to model this view, because I see on forums, on Stack Overflow, and from my experience that I was just forcing the way how I was modeling stuff from UIKit to SwiftUI, and it ended up pretty badly and wasted a lot of time, but I could have saved it just by making separate project. And last thing about separate project, it's super useful if you actually found out a problem with SwiftUI, because as I mentioned, it's still a fresh framework compared to UIKit, but there might be bugs, and that's fine. So you can report it to via technical ticket. I don't remember the exact name of it, but you can submit a ticket, and you can get in touch with Apple developer, and they will try to help you with your case. Or last year they launched labs that were happening after dub, and I learned a lot of stuff from it, because you can just sign up for labs. It was in November, I think, last year, but we also had it right now with during dub, and they'll probably ask you for a separate project. Whereas if you showed something in your real project, you may have some regulations based on the NDA or something. But if you have separate project that are using simple structs, simple lists, and you can point out, okay, this performance here is pretty bad. I'm not sure what's going on. It's going to be 100 times faster for a developer from Apple to find out the root cause of the issue. So, or you can just send it to your friend, because maybe they know more, because not everyone's working on SwiftUI right now because of the target. So, but maybe your friends started out with a new project. So that's going to be very beneficial. Yeah, so that's warm up. Moving on to workout, the real deal. So we are starting workout with a coach, right? As I said, he or she may see some issues, injuries, or maybe preferences to how to do some exercises. And so we cannot do everything, right? We were coming with some problems. So that's the same thing with projects. We rarely have a chance to start with a target from, I don't know, iOS 16, right? Or even start a new project, because we often maintain projects or just developing, adding new stuff. So we don't have a chance to start with a new navigation path, SwiftUI pattern to create navigation. So we need to keep that in mind. So how to deal with all those issues, like minimum target? For instance, very simple text field and very simple modifier, which is text input auto capitalization. I was a little bit surprised because it's only got available from iOS 15. But yeah, many of the apps, they are still having targets of iOS 11, 12, and 13, so we can use SwiftUI, or even 14, so we can use like lazy VStack. But iOS 15, that's the newest version right now, right? Because iOS 16 is still in beta. So iOS 15, that's pretty high minimum target that many of us were not going to see in the few years. So how to deal with this if you have iOS 13 target? One of the solutions is to use SPM package called introspect. That's gonna, as the name of the package implies, it's gonna introspect the underlying view, because many of the views in SwiftUI, they're being powered by UIKit elements. So for instance, in iOS 13, I think list was UI table view. It's not a UI table view anymore, but text field, apparently it's still UI text field inside. So we can use the introspect text field modifier and grab the UIKit property and assign it this way. It's not ideal, of course, because some might say that it's not very safe to ship code that's using some shenanigans like these. But Here's another suggestion how to deal with this problem. We can say, okay, our minimum target is iOS 13 or 14, not 15. But most of our users, fortunately, they're using iOS 15. So we can do this modifier that's gonna conditionally apply SwiftUI native modifier, or fall back to this introspect modifier if the user is not using iOS 15. So that's nice way. Okay, challenge number 2, UIKit and SwiftUI. And some of you that already use SwiftUI and UIKit with SwiftUI can say that, yeah, it's something that's been around since the beginning of SwiftUI, because you can use UI view controller representable, you can use UI view representable. But I'm talking about something a little bit different. What if you have more complex cases? So at the top, I have custom text field for my project that is wrapped in SwiftUI wrapper, UI view representable, but inside it's UIKit. And I want to take advantage of all those very handy modifiers like frame and border and background, all that stuff. It's super useful. So that's why I wrap it in SwiftUI view. But there are still cases when I want to set up some custom properties from UIKit. In this case, this text field should have custom keyboard. So again, I can use introspect. I also saw somewhere there's a guest where one of the developers he shared kind of like an alternative to introspect. So you don't need to use SPM package. You can just use his guest. Yeah, it's still unsafe. It's still not the way how we expect it to work, but we need to deal with it if we want to use SwiftUI and we still want to have great developer experience, but we need to still keep our minimum target down to iOS 13 or 14. And after setting keyboard, I want to make it a first responder. It's another thing that is only available from iOS 15, I guess. Focus is from iOS 15. But I also had some code already written in UIKit. So instead of doing custom modifier with focus, it was easier to just use introspect and inside call my extension that was already been around in the project for ages. Second case is you can apply introspect for a lot of views. So you can apply it, of course, to scroll view, you can apply it to table view, you can apply it to almost any major class from UIKit. Very handy. So in that case, I wanted to block bouncing vertical bounce. Of course, you're just calling introspect scroll view and you're good to go. Here's a little bit more complex case. It's not about playing around with UIKit views inside SwiftUI, but it's rather about the logic. So navigation, it's a new thing that is coming with the newest version SwiftUI that is available in iOS 16 and Mac and Watch. But you need to target iOS 16 or Mac or Watch 9. So unfortunately, that's not possible for in my project and in many of you as well. So since the project is using coordinator pattern, that is some sort of like navigation or router pattern in UI apps, in mobile apps, we can also take use of it. We don't need to re-engineer everything because we want to present SwiftUI views. first method is just UI activity view controller, and it's being presented by root view controller. That is a property of coordinator, normal stuff. But if we want to present SwiftUI view as a full screen, as a model, or as a root view of some of the tab views, you can just, of course, implement it first, and then you can wrap it in UI hosting controller, or you can make a custom extension. I didn't put it in the slide, but dot in hosting controller is just a 4 lines of code. It's a wrapper that is taking SwiftUI view and putting into UI hosting controller. And you have, again, it's working as if you used UIKit model. So that's great. And this one, it's a little bit silly, I thought initially, but because of course you have UI view representable, but there are a few methods that you need to implement, and you have generics, and they kind of intimidated me. So you can use this wrapper to just pack your UIKit view inside and present it in SwiftUI, because one of the greatest benefits of SwiftUI is that you can create fairly complex view in a matter of minutes. And if you want to create like a mockup or prototype, you don't want to deal. I even stopped like using LDB, because I can, if I make a new project, I'm gonna import my SPM package, and I'm gonna make a list with all the elements that I want to see. It's gonna be faster than using LDB. You can just see it and you can show it to your colleague, and you can even make it as a playground app and send it to your manager. So that's great. But with UIKit, it's gonna take a few minutes, which is to me it's too much. So you can use some simple wrapper that's gonna present UIKit view, and you can see if everything's right, and then you can expand on it if you want to add some extra properties, because you want to tweak update UI view methods. But from my experience, that was more than enough in most cases. Challenge number 3, SwiftUI and UIKit. It's not something that's covered very often in on web and in Stack Overflow and on Slacks. So, of course, because most of the articles are assuming that we're gonna start with SwiftUI app, and we're gonna keep it this way. But we still have a lot of code from the previous years, and we may want to still use UIKit because it's perfectly valid. It's still a great framework. It's still being developed. We're getting new features every year. But how are we going to use SwiftUI and UIKit? Some of us started to ask this question recently because the project got bigger and bigger, and there are cases when we have some nice view in SwiftUI, but we have lists. We have collection view or a table view, or we have some small custom UI view, and we want to reuse it. We don't want to rewrite it in UIKit, right? That's why we start with SwiftUI. But it's not that obvious how to do it, and starting with Mac Ventura, Watch 9, and iOS 16 and tvOS 16, we can use a built-in property called content configuration, but it's from iOS 16. So that's a no-go for many of us. But it's there. So it means that there are cases when you want to use it, and Apple sees this problem or this issue as well, so they want to address it. But what if you have target iOS 14, 13, 15? What you should do in that case? It's not going to be perfect. Again, it's not going to be as good as content configuration because It's probably well optimized under the hood, but we need to get some stuff done. So we can make this lovely class that is just a container for a view from SwiftUI, and you can present it in that case in table view, but in collection view it's pretty much the same because I tried both versions. Yeah, and it works. It had some problems with animations, but you can play with needs update constraints method and it's going to work just fine. A few caveats. First of all, if you have dynamic view, it might have some problems. I only use it for static views. So in collection view, if you, I only have view images, labels, colors, and that's all. Not sure what's going to happen if you want to make it very interactive, adding text fields, text editors, and some custom animations that might break. So again, what you should do a warm up, and you should make a separate project before jumping into SwiftUI. And at the beginning, you might think, oh, that seems a little bit wasteful because I don't need to do that with UIKit, right? I just can implement it and make sure it's going to work. Yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, you can recreate the view that I want to get in your production app in a matter of minutes and validate it and maybe see some problems if it's because of the architecture, maybe of your assumptions, or maybe, yeah, it's a bug. So you can report it. It's great. And you can let other people know that there is some issue. So maybe it's going to be addressed in the next version of iOS. So yeah, that's the way how to deal with SwiftUI and UIKit. Usually, I've been using it in the context of collection view and table view, but it's the same rules apply for views that you have in the view controller. But the biggest challenge is how to make it work in the collection view and in table view. So after doing sets and exercises with SwiftUI, it's time to have a rest, which is very, very important. And how do you rest after working out with SwiftUI? Is to have a bigger picture and sometimes not to do SwiftUI because UIKit is still there, it's gonna be there because it powers many of the elements of SwiftUI. So it's still perfectly valid framework to do UI. And you have probably a lot of custom code that's powering your app already. So there might be some cases when you should do UIKit view. We've done dynamic collection view that was written in LazyVStack. And the results were not great. The problem is that the code was mixed. So the logic was written for UIKit. So we thought that, okay, we're just going to port it to SwiftUI. It's going to be great. The performance wasn't that great because we had like hundreds of rows with many text fields, and apparently text fields are quite expensive to render, at least what I saw. And fortunately, we had most of the screen done in UIKit. So we decided, okay, let's just move to UIKit back again. And we had custom layout because right now you can write pretty nice layout in UIKit with UI. But again, it's from iOS 16 Ventura and Launch 9. So it's not as customizable as collection view because it's probably the most powerful element from UIKit. So you need to embrace it. If you have very, very complex screen, it doesn't mean that it needs to be very complex in terms of logic or interactions. our screen was complex in terms of animations and making some custom transitions. So we're setting custom offsets, which is a little bit tricky in SwiftUI. So you need to recognize when it's time to give to stop basically and revert to UIKit, or just to rewrite it in UIKit. Fortunately, we just could have used the existing view, but it's very valuable to see when it's time to use the tools that are working just fine instead of just forcing the new tool. And next thing, well-known quote from the well-known developer: "It ain't broke, don't fix it." So that was the thing that I needed to learn the hard way. And if you're hyped about SwiftUI, you may try to rewrite some of the screens that are working just fine, because you can see the benefit that if I rewrote it, it would have been much better, because now my app is like 40-50% SwiftUI, so we can push it more and more and more. But those two frameworks can coexist just fine. Don't force it, and just see. Maybe if you need to write a new screen, that's perfectly fine. Just go for SwiftUI. But first remember about the warm-up. Just see if your case is valid, and maybe you have existing elements, you can reuse them from the project. And then if you if you apply the elements, animations, used your models, and everything working fine, you can apply your modifiers, because you can embrace the SwiftUI compositional paradigm. You can use buttons instead of subclasses, and you can apply button styles. That works really nicely if you know how to do it. Yeah. Takeaways. If you need to remember one thing from this presentation, just please, it's just to start small. It applies to workouts as well. But it can save you a lot of time. Just if you're not sure, if you're not 100% sure because you've done the screen, you've seen that somebody else done that, just make a new project, play around for a few minutes, for 30 minutes, for an hour. Take your logic from existing project, and you can enjoy 4 seconds builds and iterate very rapidly. That's a great way to isolate your case and see if something's wrong with the framework or maybe with your code. In my case, 99% was my fault. Best code is the one that was never written. So if you have existing classes, just use them. UIKit is gonna stay there for a long time. As we can see, Objective-C is still there. Swift is still there. You can still use both. So keep it. And maybe you want to reuse some of the logic, so you can still tweak it to reuse in SwiftUI, but it can still power UIKit. But if you can see that, you can reuse the screen and you can maybe tweak the logic a little bit. Just keep your UI view controller with zip or with storyboard. It's fine. Yeah, use what you already have and adapt. Take it. Maybe you can create a new screen in SwiftUI. You can have your screen in UIKit. See what's going to happen. Maybe add published properties. Change how it works a little bit. Use async away if you want, and this way you're going to end up with much better code, and gonna save some time. UIKit is still cool. That's true. It still powers millions of apps, and it's gonna stay for a long time. So embrace it. The only problem is that you may feel a bit old when you go to forums and see questions like, do I need to learn UI kit? Because that was I felt this first time when I read this question, do I need to learn Objective-C? So right now it's about UI kit. I would say yeah, because I assume that most of us are working for quite some time, so we already know how it works. We should embrace SwiftUI because there's also a group of people that are thinking, okay, I feel comfortable with UI kit. It's not gonna go away anywhere. So why should I be concerned about the SwiftUI? Yeah, you need to keep in mind that there are new developers coming every year, and they might create marvelous screens in a matter of hours or days. That might take weeks sometimes in UI kit because you're messing around with constraints. So yeah, you need to adapt. So UI kit is still cool, but you need to embrace SwiftUI as well. The best source, objc.io. There's nothing about Objective-C right now, but it's about Swift and SwiftUI. But if you want to learn SwiftUI, how it works under the hood, best source, period. They're making videos, but if you're not into content like this, they're still publishing great articles, so you can read them. They are maintaining gigantic repository on GitHub, so you don't need to pay, because I think it's a subscription to see videos, but you can go to GitHub and read articles or jump into the code, download the sample code, run it, see how it works. And yeah, it's probably the best source by far, maybe except Apple sample code, but still you need to keep in mind that it's not meant to be used in production, but it's a great reference point to see if the stuff that I want to create is doable in SwiftUI or not. And maybe you can even mess around with the code, import your models, modify some stuff, and see, instead of rewrite Fruta or Food Truck, I think that the newest project is Food Truck. It's even on GitHub, so that's great. You don't need to go to even to Apple website. You can just jump into GitHub, download it, and yeah, play with it and take a rest. You have a lot of code in UI kit, and you can still use it. So it's probably it's the same stuff as in the point number 2 and number 3. Take a rest. It's gonna be a little bit difficult, like with just any workout, but it's worth it because you can make some nice UI way much faster. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Gonna go to questions. I'm gonna start. So I haven't been brave enough to try SwiftUI introspect yet, but I'm curious what kind of things do go wrong, if at all, with it. Because like in my mind, I'm not really sure if it's like, you know, something totally weird happens and you end up using gigabytes of memory, or if it just doesn't work and that's the end of the story.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, because I've done a few small projects using it, and also in the production project. It's not yet on App Store, but it's using some of the modifiers from Introspect heavily. The performance so far, I haven't seen any problems yet, but I haven't dug deep inside like I haven't used instruments. It was mostly about like setting responder or changing the bounce effect. So you need to use it wisely. Of course, it's not about like taking your whole UI kit classes and wrapping it in SwiftUI and applying it. So there might be some side effects. So that's true. So that's why I advise that you need to use it sparingly and prefer built-in SwiftUI modifiers. it shouldn't be. I've seen some people using it in production and they said it's fine, but it's just a disclaimer that don't rely on it. So if you see that like with auto capitalization modifier, just use it. And in case of low iOS version, gonna hold back to introspect.
Do we know what just on the topic of introspect, and pardon my SwiftUI ignorance, but do we know if Apple changed the kind of backing element from, I think you mentioned before, UI text field, maybe switch to UI collection view in a different version of SwiftUI, and you've called introspect? I'm assuming you could call a modifier on a thing that no longer exists to just blow your whole app up. What's Apple's advice in that situation?
Great question. That's something I've been thinking about before this talk.
Because it feels like an inevitability, right?
Yes.
It's gonna happen.
Yes. So some people will say that it's weird that we need to use those hacks in a way, right? But on the other hand, I noticed that like with table view, it's been it was using UI table view in iOS 13, and from iOS 14, it's some custom SwiftUI mechanism. But starting from iOS 14 and 15, we're getting more and more modifiers from UIKit. So it's probably not matching one-to-one. So if you're using iOS 13 and 14, you're using introspect, you can access all modifiers, and then from iOS 15 you have like custom separators and all that stuff. But it kind of aligns well with the release cycle. So starting from iOS 14, we got way more modifiers for list and for each structures. So I imagine that it's still recommended to use native modifiers, but they probably know that some of the apps are using this. So since it's been around for iOS 13, it's already like 3 years, so they're not gonna retroactively remove it.
And it just sounds like it's a matter of maintenance moving forward, right? Every time there's a new iOS release, you're going to need to check anywhere you're using that stuff.
Right.
If Apple have changed the underlying view piece and given you a new modifier, switch to using the new modifier, and just stay up to date with your releases. I suppose it just becomes a maintenance thing to consider.
So that's why I think it's a good idea to use this
that bit of code that you showed around iOS 15, use the modifier.
That's true. I think like, okay, so it's a little bit of hot take, but if you have iOS 13 or 14 as a target, and you want to keep it, and things may get a little bit broken or glitchy in some way, it's probably a different case if you're working on a big project for a big client. But like if you can see that, okay, it may be a little broken, I cannot come up with any case where you can that's going to reflect this assumption, but you can say, okay, like it's not perfect, like with Swift first or second version, right? It was breaking fairly often, and it was getting better and better, and you cannot take all the Objective-C goodies and make brand new language without any breaking changes. And SwiftUI is taking even more. It's even more challenging because they're trying to wrap multiple frameworks that are very different from Watch to iOS to Mac, and to make it work. So small disclaimer: most of the materials were about iOS. I know that it might be a little bit more difficult on Mac. On Watch, yes, there are some problems because I've been reusing some of the views from iOS and on Watch. And let's say that like modals, they were not getting canceled on Watch, which should have been applied automatically. But yeah, it's just the way it is.
Cool.
Is it okay to throw in an opinion?
Yep.
Just on that
Yep.
introspect topic? SwiftUI, in my understanding, should make no assumptions about the underlying platform. Mainly because your same views, to as much as you can, you should be saying, hey, here is what I would like, describe it in a declarative way, and then let the system go off and do the implementation. That way, your text field, you just say, I want a text field. Your code shouldn't make an assumption of it's running on Mac, it's running on iOS, it's running on watchOS. It should just know, hey, I will put in a text field. As such, my advice is always never use introspect, because you really can't make assumptions. And even with point releases in an iOS version, Apple can and will, this is just my understanding of what I've heard, change the backend implementation. In my own playing around, I saw that very early iOS 13, things changed. Like, it can, will, and does happen. So please try and avoid introspect as much as you can.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's I was trying to emphasize it during the talk, but again, if there is any way to not to use it, just go for it. Of course, there's going to be modifiers, but I assume that if you even looking on it, you're probably in a situation where you cannot use it, or you need to rewrite it in UIKit. So it's a trade-off. You need to think if you should use a UIKit element, or you can use this trick. But going back to the point of like not making assumptions, because it's an unopinionated way to declare UI, right? It's a bit tough, and that's how I was approaching SwiftUI at the beginning, and it was source of annoyance to me, because I was looking this way, and later I realized how much bigger of a challenge it is to wrap all those frameworks, and they are so different. I'm talking about Mac, iOS, Watch, TV, and God knows what else what's gonna come soon. Sounds good in theory, but it's like it reminds me kind of like with Swift. It was a little bit rigid at the beginning. If you were coming from Objective-C, there was not that much like a selector or this dynamic programming. But right now, if you're using Swift 5.6 or 7, you have property wrappers, you have like some magic that is powering combine and SwiftUI previews, demangling, and all that stuff that I'm not even sure what's going on. But yeah, that's how do you progress if you want to make some changes. So yeah, it's tough, and it's perfectly valid to see it this way. But just to make a counter argument to that, and it's perfectly valid. But I just decided that it's not going to work, because there are more and more modifiers like binding and published, and there is a trade-off of making it friendly to newcomers, to make it very reactive, versus making it to follow the rules of like platform agnostic DSL. Yeah.
But presumably on both the argument that modifiers might change anyway, and your point of, hey, should you try to avoid this? Not all of us are doing cross-platform. And if you have to support the older OSs, there's nothing wrong with modifying how to change. Well, here's the modifiers that were in 13, and here's the modifier, and here's the native one. So, and if it's a little bit unstable in the 13 and 14, what percentage of your users
Yeah, so it's something that you need to just go with your team and analyze it.
It's not that it's
Because
going to be unstable in 13 and 14 though, right? It's going to be suddenly unstable in 16. It's going to crash only if you're not actively maintaining your project. So if your project's under active maintenance, you're going to need to check it. 13 doesn't suddenly start crashing. You're running 13 on your phone. It's when Apple read that out and put 16 in and the underlying
If 15
class.
modifier works and it breaks in 16, you're going to know that all over the place.
100%.
So, but
The bigger concern would be it breaking in like 15.3.2.
Yes.
And then it's like, oops.
yeah.
Yeah, I can't see Apple doing that.
I
that's not-
agree, but it's just
Yeah.
the possibility
Yeah.
kind of worries
No,
me.
no one from Apple's here. It's all right. It's okay. But they don't. So that's major point release stuff, right? So,
Yeah.
but it's a classic. We get 3 months to test this shit.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
no.
And that maintenance could be billable hours as well.
Oh, 100% it is, absolutely.
A few minutes.
That's a tough break.
I run a business.
Oh,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I don't think, so if you decide on if you assume that, okay, it's not gonna break on iOS 13 dot something because they're still pushing critical fixes and it's working just fine and you don't have thousands of crashes or issues, it's okay. And in some of the cases, if you mix SwiftUI and UIKit, I even needed to swizzle some of the methods. So because save area plus keyboard on SwiftUI view embedded in navigation UIKit view was causing some problems, and I cannot avoid it anyway. So fortunately, our friend Peter Steinberger, he released a good swizzle to remedy that. So but it's a thing to keep in mind. So if you want to push SwiftUI in production and you're talking to your managers and they're saying that, okay, if you need to go those hurdles and hack, let's say, because they think it's a hacking, then you should. You just use UIKit, right? That's totally fine. Or maybe for simply use you can use SwiftUI because it's not as malleable as UIKit for the price of super rapid development and reactive features. Question? We have a question.
No, I think it's been covered.
Cool. Presumably the other option is that, okay, you can't disable bounce on 13 or whatever. Just don't try and do the modifier you'd like to have. A small percentage of the users won't get that nice little extra bit of gloss and sparkle.
Yep. You should
Another option.
just get iPhone
Just don't
14 and make my life easier.
Well, I can elaborate a bit. I think we've been struggling. I do use Introspect as well for production app, and yes, the risk is that in a certain new version, it's going to crash because you're essentially trying to call something that's not there anymore.
Yep.
So that's the risk, and you'll probably find that out pretty quickly. But you need to release a fix, and it's best to. I'd say it's best to avoid it. And Amy's totally right because SwiftUI is built around, you're not supposed to tell it what to do, but rather how it should look. And so it's a hack.
Is it going to crash or is it just going to not build? Because if
No,
it-
it'll
No,
crash.
it'll
It's
crash.
already built.
It'll be,
App's already on your phone.
Updated the
iOS
app.
16 comes along, the backing class changes, you call a method that no longer exists in iOS 16, boom. You haven't rebuilt an app and redeployed it.
I'm not entirely sure. We do have an expert that might know.
You,
but
you, you may need to go to Introspect and see if they're force unwrapping it or making some magic. I think it should just it's not going to be evaluated because it cannot find because it's not going to call the closure and with
Depends on how they're doing it.
Usually they would replicate before removing, right? So should get some warnings before.
They should.
crash.
Yeah.
Usually.
The best way use conditional.
it's already internal, so they wouldn't. There's nothing to deprecate. It's
Yeah.
just their internal way of
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah.
So, and that's the risk, right?
Yeah.
So,
But it's a good. I think a lot of people got frustrated in iOS 14 because that was the first release when they changed underlying class, right? So they moved from UI table view to SwiftUI structure. So I saw some of the people posting that they were hacking the separators in table view, right? Because that was the case that where people got frustrated, and it's something that you want to make a clean table view without separators, and they got angry. But I think in 14 something they started to add like not very explicit modifiers, but you can it's a kind of gray area because it's official. You can apply insets, but it's not for separators. So if you go to some of the threads, you can see that, oh, so for iOS 13, you can do this. You can use UI table view proxy. For iOS 14, you can do some offsets from SwiftUI, so it's going to work. And for iOS 15, you can just make it clear. Yeah. Yep.
A story, if I may. I am building an app at the moment, and for one of the key screens in the app, I needed to be able to read the scroll offset of a scroll view. So initially I put in some modifiers into SwiftUI that would enable me to read the scroll offset because it didn't have them to start with. But then I needed to be able to set the scroll offset to an actual pixel, and you can only set it to an element in the scroll view. So you don't have actual pixel control of the up and down of the scroll view. So I had the bright idea that, well, it must be a scroll view underneath. So I took a regular UIKit scroll view and I wrapped it in SwiftUI, and I put my SwiftUI stuff inside the scroll view, and it started working, and then it didn't. For exactly
What happened?
you were saying, because internally Apple is doing who knows what, and then making stuff that doesn't behave the same way as the equivalent in UIKit. So if you use the UIKit equivalent, it doesn't work the same. It doesn't have the same controls, doesn't have the same properties, and it just doesn't work.
It's like all things in that kind of Apple black box ecosystem, right? Like you can make assumptions about what's going on internally, but you don't have knowledge.
No,
You just don't.
fundamentally
It's not how
also
it
going
works.
back to Amy's point is that SwiftUI is a system for making diffs. And
No way.
the runtime is actually responsible for taking your diff and implementing it on screen. And it's completely up to the runtime how it does that.
And that runtime can change every
Yeah.
major milestone.
And,
that's-
you know,
that's
each, well, yeah, and also, you know, it's super optimized so that the tiniest little update only creates the tiniest little diff. And yeah, I mean, kudos to them for making it work, but trying to dig inside the black box and figure out what's going on.
Well, that's the point, right? You should.
That's
Yeah.
exactly
And it's
right. That's
very
what I
fast.
often get to with people. So I'm like, stop trying to dig into the black box.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
Use
Oh, but
that
I've worked
black
out it's a
box.
table view. It is today. It doesn't mean it will be
And that's-
tomorrow.
The point of your
Yeah.
talk, right? Sometimes use UIKit because
Yeah.
that's what you.
That's
want.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
And I think one of the most frustrating things about it is that a scroll view in SwiftUI doesn't necessarily look or work the same as the UIKit
No,
scroll, which is
it's
just
nothing
stop
like
making
it.
assumptions.
Yeah.
That's.
Yeah.
Back to your point, small projects.
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
find out what it does.
Yeah, yeah.
Plug in some fake data that does, and
then
you make
they-
it look like what you want.
and
And you
then they
can't find out why.
Yeah, if you see the case that, okay, if you want to, if I want to implement something in SwiftUI and I'm trying to access some of the like non-existing property like content offset, I imagine from UI scroll view, and it's not there. And from iOS 14, it's like a scroll reader, but it's not pixel perfect, right? So you can like play around with overlay views and stuff like that. Maybe you're gonna succeed, but of course, yeah. So you can just make a separate project and maybe, but you said like if the smallest, the tiniest change gonna refresh the view. So if you have small project on one of your friends already experienced that, they're not gonna dive into your production app because of the regulations or they're not very keen on looking on it. But if it's a small app, they can inspect it and maybe they can say that, okay, I need to use quotable view. That's gonna, you can set a custom rules to diff, or maybe you see that, oh, I'm just like me, I'm taking content offset and setting as a state. So that's gonna change the state on the underlying view, so it may reevaluate the view again and again and again. So yeah, that's a good point. It's something to just see and play, and if the issue persists, just go back to it.
If anyone's curious as to how Apple explains a lot of these comments, the demystifying SwiftUI talk from dub21, definitely worth a watch. Also, doing a search for the differences between declarative and imperative programming, and particularly UI, will show a lot of the differences between SwiftUI being declarative and UIKit being imperative.
Yeah, that's the best source, and sample code is also great a source of insights into how it works and how they expect us to use it. And yeah, and of course, again, for the price of flexibility and customization, you need to give up some of the modifiers, and sometimes you may even say, okay, to your designer, that's gonna take, like, to make it bouncy, it's gonna take ages. so you need to
More sprints. We're not doing it.
Yeah, so you're gonna estimate it as
Sprint to 4 weeks each, aren't they?
But yeah,
I've done that.
it's just it might be frustrating, because I know that some of my friends, it's not very related to the topic, but they're saying that we've been experiencing some of the very nice UI elements in iOS 6 or 7 or 8, where you had like this when you were deleting paths from passbook, it was like that was really nice. And right now it's a little bit rigid, because it's quite difficult to tweak. But on the other hand, I saw some of the one of developer on Twitter, and he's playing with timeline view and canvas, and the results are fantastic. So it's still doable to make like really custom UI. But maybe, but yeah, it's still like something that you need to keep in mind, that it's a steep learning curve at the beginning. But yeah, it's in iOS 16, I would say with layout, with navigation path, with timeline view, with canvas, you can achieve great results still. Yeah.
Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. We know the weather's pretty rubbish, but we appreciate you coming. Get home safely, and we'll see you next month. Thank you. Thanks for everyone watching online.
Yeah, 10 seconds.
This is the office.